Hey everyone, and welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a totally defining and honestly pretty turbulent chapter of our history, the 1980s. This was a decade that seriously tested our national stability, with some incredibly intense regional conflicts. So how did we actually survive it? Well, today we're going to unpack exactly how regional aspirations challenged and ultimately shaped the nation we live in right now. And that brings us to the core puzzle driving our whole exploration today. Just think about it. How do you balance democratic rights with national unity? It is a massive challenge. When people in a specific region demand more autonomy, or maybe even separation, how does a democracy respect those local voices without the entire country literally fracturing apart? Keep that tension in the back of your mind as we go. Here is our roadmap. We'll hit 5 key stops, starting with the sheer scale of India's diversity, followed by our unique democratic approach to handling it. Then we'll dig into 2 complex historical case studies, Jammu and Kashmir and the movements in the Northeast. Finally, we'll wrap it up with some major lessons for national integration. All right, kicking things off with Section 1, the challenge of diversity. You know, it's pretty wild to remember that right after independence, a lot of outside observers looked at India's vast differences and confidently predicted there was no way a unified country could last. The stakes were incredibly high. Just look at the timeline. In the 1940s, the nation was just grappling with partition and the absolute giant task of integrating the princely states. Then, moving right into the 1950s, early secessionist movements flared up in places like Nagaland, and some groups in the Dravid movement in the South briefly toyed with the idea of a completely separate country. Notice how the state often responded by literally redrawing internal boundaries, like when Punjab and Haryana were created in 1966, or much later when Chhattisgarh, Uttarakhand, and Jharkhand were formed in the 2000s. But as we'll see, simply drawing new lines on a map didn't magically resolve all the underlying tensions permanently. Because the thing is, regional identity isn't always the enemy of national identity. Take the Uttarakhand movement, for example. We've got this amazing poster here appealing to citizens in 7 different languages. It's, frankly, a brilliant reminder that people can fiercely advocate for a distinct regional identity while still feeling completely devoted to the overarching Indian Union. You can absolutely be deeply rooted in your region and equally committed to your nation at the exact same time. Which transitions us perfectly to Section 2, the Indian democratic approach. How exactly does the nation handle all these varied demands on a philosophical and constitutional level? To really grasp this, we've got to contrast a couple of mindsets. Historically, the European approach kind of looked at cultural diversity as a direct threat to the nation itself. Basically, if you were different, you were a risk to unity. But the Indian approach, it completely flips that script. It operates on this core principle that the nation will not deny the rights of different regions and linguistic groups to retain their distinct cultures. Unity is actually sought alongside diversity. The nation does not mean the negation of the region. The crucial takeaway is captured perfectly in this textbook quote. Democracy allows the political expressions of regional aspirations and does not look upon them as anti-national. Think of it like a pressure valve. Because our democratic politics allows parties to run specifically on regional identities, these groups actually get adequate attention and a seat at the table when policies are being made. And that prevents all that regional pride from bottling up and turning into anti-national resentment. Okay, let's look at a real-world example in Section 3, tension in Jammu and Kashmir. Of course, applying this democratic approach hasn't always been perfectly smooth. This region has a deeply complex history with both internal and external ramifications. Before we even talk about the politics, we have to understand the people. Jammu and Kashmir is definitely not a monolith. It's a rich tapestry made up of 3 very distinct regions. Down in the foothills and plains of Jammu, you have a predominantly Hindu population living right alongside Muslims and Sikhs. Head up into the Kashmir Valley, and it's a Kashmiri Muslim majority living alongside Hindus, Sikhs, and Buddhists. And then over in the mountainous terrain of Ladakh, there's a much smaller population that's split almost equally between Buddhists and Muslims. This deep internal diversity is exactly why the politics here are so incredibly layered. So, tracing the history here over the decades, following independence, Sheikh Abdullah actually initiated major land reforms. But differences with the center over Kashmir's status led to his dismissal and detention back in 1953. Decades later, in 1974, an agreement was reached with Indira Gandhi, and he returned as chief minister. But a huge turning point hit in 1987. The assembly elections that year resulted in a massive but highly disputed victory for the National Conference Congress Alliance. A widespread belief that the elections were rigged, combined with deep resentment against an inefficient administration, generated a severe political crisis, and that directly escalated into a prolonged insurgency. And that brings us to recent history, as outlined in our text. On the 5th of August 2019, Article 370, which had previously given the state special status, was abolished. Under the Jammu and Kashmir Reorganization Act, the state was formally reconstituted into two completely separate union territories, Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh. All right, shifting gears and jumping across the map to Section 4, movements in the Northeast. The politics here are uniquely delicate, completely shaped by a history of isolation, vast international borders, and previously weak communication links with the rest of India. According to our chapter, three dominant issues have historically driven the politics in the Northeast. First up, demands for autonomy, which, as we know, the Indian Constitution is generally well-equipped to accommodate. Second, movements for actual secession and creating a separate country. Now that poses a far more severe challenge to the state. And third, strong opposition to outsiders migrating into the region. Let's zoom in on how a secessionist demand actually plays out on the ground. Take the Mizoram crisis. Back in 1959, a totally devastating famine struck the Mizo Hills. When the locals felt the Assam government failed to step up and help them, that environmental crisis sparked an absolute political firestorm. It fueled the formation of the Mizo National Front, led by Lal Denga, which ended up launching a long, armed struggle for full secession from India. But here is the absolute biggest takeaway from the Mizoram case. Despite the armed assertions, despite their oppression by the government, and even the temporary collapse of electoral processes, the conflict ultimately concluded in a negotiated settlement. A dialogue successfully settled those heavily contentious issues firmly within the Indian constitutional framework. It really goes to show that political settlements can resolve even deeply entrenched separatism. Which brings us right to our final stop, Section 5, Lessons for National Integration. When you step back, what do we actually learn from all this turbulence in the 1980s? Well, our sources lay out three vital lessons. First off, regional aspirations are completely normal in a democracy. It happens worldwide, from Scotland and the UK to the Basques in Spain. Second, talk, don't just suppress. When militancy erupted in Punjab or insurgency broke out in Assam and Mizoram, the government ultimately opted for negotiated settlements rather than just treating them as simple law and order problems. And third, a flexible, accommodative constitution is hands down your absolute best defense against separatism. Honestly, all of this distills down into one simple but really powerful phrase from the text. Nation building is an ongoing process. It is not something you finish up on Independence Day, check off a list, and put in a box. It requires constant accommodation and dialogue, meaning the democracy that you participate in today is still actively building the nation. So I'm going to leave you with this final question from the chapter to think about. Do all regional movements inevitably lead to separatism? Based on what we saw from the 1980s, from those multi-language posters in Uttarakhand to the peace accords in Mizoram, consider how a simple willingness to listen can entirely change the trajectory of regional pride. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning and keep exploring how our history shapes the unity we share today.